We're also going to look at the Russian Mennonite, the Swiss Mennonite, Amish Mennonite, illegitimate births, secret adoptions. There is no mathematical way that all of us could have absolutely unique ancestry.
Laureen is the archivist librarian at Conrad Grebel University College in Waterloo, Ontario. Prior to her arrival at Conrad Grebel in 2009, Laureen worked as a freelance public historian writing histories for Ontario Mennonite organizations. She also managed an audiovisual library, resourcing Mennonite churches. Her hometown is the farming community of Vineland, Ontario, an area rich in Mennonite history. During her undergraduate years, she lived and studied at Conrad Grebel. She has a degree in history and master's degrees in religion and culture and the library and archival sciences. She is the current president of the Mennonite Historical Society of Canada. Laureen has recently been named as co-author of a forthcoming book on the history of Mennonites in Canada from 1970 to the present. She lives in Kitchener, Ontario with her husband and 2 children and loves to travel and garden. Welcome, Laureen. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Audrey. We're all getting used now to doing things virtually, and these are some of the ways that we reach out virtually at the Mennonite Archives of Ontario. We have our website, of course, the Mennonite Archives of Ontario, which has a lot of our archival descriptions and a lot of other information, including a genealogy guide, a guide to doing peace research at our archives, and so on. We have an Instagram account, which we have a lot of fun with, mostly trying to dispel the mysteries behind archival and library work. You can find that on Instagram at grebel.library.archives. And we are part of MAID. I'm sure you've heard lots about MAID already. All of our photographs are on MAID, and many of our archival descriptions are starting to be on MAID. If you were to come to our building, this is what it would look like. We're at Conrad Grebel University College on the University of Waterloo campus. The library and archives occupies what you see there as the 2nd floor of that kind of metallic building, and it extends onto the 3rd floor, the top floor of that brick building beside it. So we have quite a large and roomy and bright space, and the archives, the vault itself, is a building within a building. It sits in the center of that metallic looking building. So that's where we hide all our treasures. This is me in our processing room with one of our donors. I'm just going over with him some of his family materials that he brought in. It's always one of the favorite parts of my job to hear the stories of families and individuals and congregations and figure out how best to describe them so that others can have access to them. And this is just a look into our archives reading room, which is located within the library. And here I'm talking to a class. I'm actually holding the oldest item in our archives, which is a pamphlet, Reformation pamphlet from 1520. So I chose the topic family trees tonight. Why did I do that? When I started at the archives 11 years ago now, there was a large print of the Daniel and Maria Steiner family tree from Ohio outside of my office. I didn't put it there. It was just there when I arrived. It was very large print, maybe 2 by 3 feet. And what you see here is a detail from that print. And what I noticed is that as people walked by my office, and they may have absolutely no connection to the family, they might know nothing about Mennonites, but they would stop and look at the tree, try to trace the lines, try to imagine the lives of these people. And it just kind of proved to me again and again how fascinating family trees are to people and how they can really pull at their imaginations. And so I said at that point, someday I will do an exhibit that will show the rest of the family trees in the archives to the world. And that exhibit is currently up in our building, which is unfortunately closed right now, but I will share with you some of the pieces from that exhibit. The exhibit is called Growing Family, Design and Desire in Mennonite Genealogy. And I'll say more in a little bit about what I mean by design and desire. We're also going to look at 3 different family trees over the next few minutes. One is a Russian Mennonite family tree, one is a Swiss Mennonite family tree, and one is an Amish Mennonite family tree, and they're all very different. So let's get started. And as you can see from this very first image, doesn't look much like a tree at all. This is the family chart of a man named Johann Jansen, or Hans Jansen, as it says in the very middle there. And it was done by his great-great-great-grandson, a man named Abraham Epp, who lived in the Niagara region in the 1940s and 1950s. And what Abraham did is he took his Prussian Mennonite ancestor, Hans Jansen, and his 2 wives, Agneta Fast and Maria Bergman, and put them in the center and put the descendants to the outside. So it's a very unusual kind of chart, and it's amazing how many of them he was able to cram in there. I'll give you a closer look now. This is what the center of the chart looks like, with Johann and his children with Maria around the outside. He and Agatha were childless together. So Hans Jansen started out in Prussia and was the first of his family to emigrate to Imperial Russia, now Ukraine. And the people, his descendants who occupy the outside of this rectangle, are all, as much as I can tell, in Canada. So this chart represents migration through 2 countries and a family still connected despite that migration. So Abraham made obviously an interesting choice in how he depicted his family. And when it comes to family trees, I like to talk about these 2 words, design and desire. Design, because each family tree maker makes decisions about how they will place, how they will describe the family information. And desire, because each family tree maker has a motivation. Why do they do it? What kind of statement are they trying to make? They must have some kind of deep motivation, I figure, or why would they go to all of this painstaking work? In this image, there are clues to both Abraham's design and his desire. He places his immigrant ancestor at the center, but as I said before, there's also immigrants around the edges. By the way, I might add on a personal note, my family is on here as well. We are connected here. So why did he do this? Why did he feel that he wanted to connect these people so directly? And I think these 2 migrations had something to do with it. He wanted these people to know that across time and space, they were all still connected. I'll tell you a funny little story about this tree. As I mentioned, it's part of my family tree, and my aunt and uncle, who are married to each other, came in one day and looked at it, and they each found their names on this tree. This will not be a surprise to many Mennonites that we are often related to each other in many different ways. But we kind of joke about that, but it's actually one of the most common things in the world. There is no mathematical way that all of us could have absolutely unique ancestry. We are all related to each other in more than one way. The term for this is pedigree collapse, which is, I think, an interesting an interesting term that you might want to use, drop in conversation someday, pedigree collapse. So I don't know if any of you have experienced family trees of this kind with an ancestor at the center working out. This was the first time I had actually seen it. And it might look strange for the most part, but for most of history, the thing we know as the family tree would have been very unusual to most people. Let me show you what I mean. So in the ancient Roman world, if you were depicting your family in pictorial form, you would put your ancestors at the top. That's the place furthest away chronologically from you, and it's also the place of greatest reverence, the top of an image. But this became a problem for people trying to depict Jesus' family tree. Can you think why? How do you put Jesus, the most revered person in the tree, at the bottom? Jesus is a descendant, but he's also the most revered. So illustrators looked to the idea of the Jesse tree, Jesse, father of David in the Old Testament, and they inverted this image, placing Jesse at the bottom, and from the root of Jesse, from the stump of Jesse, out comes the various descendants of Jesse and David. And then we finally have, as you can see here, Jesus and Mary at the top. And this is a very common image. Some of you might be familiar with the Jesse tree already, but you might not be familiar with the idea of how different this was from family depictions in the rest of the ancient world. And it's the roots of what we now know of as the family tree. So the other thing about a tree is that we get the image of upward movement and growth. It's not just that you're relying on your ancestor being the best and you are just great by being connected to them. Your ancestors provide the growth and flourishing which you now experience. So it's actually a very optimistic image, and one that is very suited to the modern world where we like to think a lot about growth and expansion. So here is a family tree from our archives that is more typical. This is a woman named Sibylla Bauman in the 1950s. She didn't make the tree, but she had it commissioned. This is the family tree of Isaac Cressman and his two successive wives, Barbara and Elizabeth. And by the way, Barbara and Elizabeth were sisters, as well as being the successive wives of Isaac Cressman. On each one of these tiny little branches in this tree is a name from the early 1800s all the way through to the 1960s. And Sibylla is standing at a family reunion, and she's standing on the farm where the family settled, coming up from Pennsylvania to Waterloo region, along the banks of the Grand River. Here is an image, that same image, but in color, and I apologize, I was not able to get into the archives to get a better image than this, but I think it gives you the idea here of what it looks like. The tree has Psalm 1 verse 3 along the bottom. I'll read the whole verse. They are like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in its season, and their leaves do not wither. In all that they do, they prosper. So again, this idea of prospering, of flourishing is very important. I also find it interesting how some of these family trees are depicted not only on a very specific location, often a settler location, but they might even have some farm buildings depicted. They're very specific in their location, which is interesting because for settler families, their roots are elsewhere. They're not actually in the ground where they are, where they have settled. This is also interesting to think about today when we know so much more about the history of Indigenous peoples in North America and the role of colonists in changing their lives in unbelievable ways. And so I wonder if we would create family trees in quite the same way. How would we depict our roots on the land? That would be, I think, an interesting question for family tree makers to explore. Here's another close-up example of that Cressman family tree, just showing again the interconnection of sisters and brothers and cousins and aunts and uncles across generations. And you'll notice too how the artist had to bend the branches and bring branches up to sort of fill in the gaps. As much as we like to think of families as kind of naturally forming a tree, sometimes, you know, it doesn't quite work out in tree shape. But we family tree makers really try to get that shape of the tree in there. Even if we did it more precisely, it might not even look so much like a tree. So part of what I'm saying here is that every depiction of our family, there's some kind of values that are at work here. Some of you may have done an Onondaga chart. It simply means ancestor chart. And it's a very basic, you yourself usually started off, and then your parents, and then all of your ancestors previously to that. So it puts the individual at the top or at the center. This kind of chart became very popular at the turn of the last century in the early 1900s, when people were really thinking about exploring their mental and physical health from the perspective of their ancestors. And unfortunately, it got tangled up in eugenics thinking for a while. But the Onondaga chart is still used today, and it's still useful in different ways. But it does come with a value system. Some of you may have done more emotional explorations of your family through a genogram, or there's all kinds of emotional mapping tools out there that can be used. So this is not just stating how you are related by blood to people, but how you are related emotionally to people in your family. One of the most interesting examples, places where I find genograms, is in pastors' archives. Often if they went to seminary, they had some kind of training in family therapy, and that often required them to do some kind of thinking about their place in their own family, and that's when these kinds of charts would tend to be used. So the third family tree I want to share with you today is an Amish Mennonite family tree, Brenneman family tree. And this is a picture from the 1940s, and you can see hanging on the wall of the barn there at a family reunion, a tree done by a teenager named Laureen Roth. That name might be familiar to some of you, especially in Amish Mennonite history. She spent a lifetime following, bringing together Amish Mennonite families through genealogy, tracking them through Europe. She had all kinds of great stories about that. But this is her first attempt, and it's on a window blind. I guess, you know, being Amish Mennonite, very economical, found the window blind, and was able to paint a tree on it. She also caused a bit of a sensation in the family because she, through her research, realized that the name of her great-great-grandmother that her great-grandfather had given her was wrong. And in fact, the person who was her great-grandmother, here's the tree in color, you can see it more up close. It's quite large. It's about 2.5 feet by 6-7 feet, actually nearly 8 feet high. oh, it's cutting me off for some reason, but at the bottom there, if you saw the two names of the two immigrant ancestors, the woman's name would be Lydia Leonard, and Leonard being an Irish name. So Lorraine actually discovered that their family had an Irish ancestor, which none of them had known. So we sometimes think as Mennonites that, oh, we just know our family trees backwards and forwards, but actually there are a lot of surprises there that can happen. And perhaps you have experienced surprises of your own, in your own family tree research. I often hear stories of illegitimate births, secret adoptions, sometimes a family member who committed a serious crime, sometimes a branch of a family that is just dropped off completely and later rediscovered. There are lots of stories there. And it's interesting again to look at genealogical values and how those have changed over time. I have here a genealogical manual from the early part of the last century. And in it, it says that although it may be unsavory, record the truth. That is something unusual or disgraceful about your family. Record the truth, but avoid making it prominent. Don't go into detail about such matters. You will find plenty of other things to record of which you will be proud. But it's interesting how times have changed these days. Genealogical guides are more likely to encourage us to explore and even embrace the messiness of family life as a way of honoring the lives of those who lived before and understanding our own place within the family system. And today, family tree makers have many options for doing that. I want to just conclude by showing you briefly a couple of other ways that the family messiness can get expressed. Here is a page from a family Bible, a fairly typical formulaic marriage page, but you'll notice that someone has written in beside the names Josiah Oberholzer and Hannah Snyder, second wife. There's no place on the form for that kind of notation, but they felt that very important to be there. And they also included at the bottom that just to make sure that people understand that this person was the son of Abraham and Sarah Erb Oberholzer. So there are ways in which we take very formulaic things and shoehorn the information in that we feel is important. Here's another great example. This one's much older, from the late 1700s. A man named Johannes or John Brubaker, and he is here filled out a form that was printed in Pennsylvania. A lot of printers made their money doing this kind of thing, printing out blank forms, maybe getting someone to color. But we can also see here that, although it might be hard to see on the picture, someone has also added some kind of frock door-like leaves at the top there, leaves and flowers at the top of the heart, and that is hand-drawn. But you'll notice here, if we look down toward the bottom of the heart, that he was born in Cocalico Township, Lancaster County, North America, and the following words are crossed out. And it says, in English, he was baptized with the name, and that is crossed out. Of course, as Mennonites, infants were not baptized. So instead, it was written in pen there, Heist Johannes Brubaker. So his name is Johannes. So here's a great example of how, as Mennonites, we have taken the common forms of family trees and we have, through art and through expression, made them our own. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that I hope you enjoyed this look at different family trees. Perhaps you have some family tree stories to share. We didn't even talk about some recent developments such as genetic testing, computer databases. There's all kinds of new things happening all the time in how families are depicted. So I guess if I would leave you with one question, it would be, if you were to design a family tree of your own, completely from scratch, if you had a completely free hand, how would you do it? Would you do it in the traditional way? Of course, what is the traditional way? Would you try something completely new? Would it even be a tree at all? Something to think about. I think, though, if there's one common thread through all these images, it's that we have this strong desire to understand our family connections, not only to those who have gone before, but to those who are with us now. And we imagine where the family tree might take us in the future.
And maybe you just want to, for those who don't know, want to say what a grandma number is and how it helps.
Sure. So there's, again, something else fascinating I could have talked about is the grandma database. This was started many years ago, and it's a genealogical database that is almost completely entered by volunteers. Just about anyone can sign up and enter data. And each time you enter a new person, they get assigned a number. And so that number helps you more precisely locate which Laureen Harder you're talking about, although I must say I am the only Laureen Harder in there, so that makes it easier. But when you get names like John Jansen, very common names, it helps if everyone has a number.
Laureen, can you say what kind of primary sources people might look for if they're trying to verify ancestors in their family trees?
I'm just trying to think out loud here, because I know there are many different Mennonite groups have kind of different go-to sources. Maybe I'll just say a little bit about the Ontario experience. So Mennonites first came to Ontario in 1786 or so, the first Mennonites to come to Canada. From 1786 until about 1835, there are very few records, and there are certainly records because Mennonites were not allowed to officiate marriages in Ontario until the mid-1830s, a dissenting church. So you had to be married by a justice of the peace or your local Anglican priest had to marry you. So these are the kinds of interesting challenges we come up with in terms of Mennonite genealogy. In those cases, you have to try to look at government records, and justice of the peace records, which are somewhat sketchy. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it often depends on the history of the particular group. Government records can be useful. Church records can be useful. Again, you run across the Mennonite habit of baptizing adults instead of children. So people coming to me with, say, an Anglican background, I have to explain that, no, you're not going to find the birth record necessarily of one. There is a Mennonite website in Canada called MennoniteGenealogy.com that is particularly good for Russian Mennonite church registers and so on. My website at the Mennonite Archives of Ontario deals somewhat with that, but also the Swiss and Amish Mennonite groups. And there are new sources coming up all the time. So we just try and keep on top of them.
Erla is wondering, do you have much experience with genetic testing, and do you recommend it?
Personally, I have not done it. I've seen results from various labs or companies that provide it from different people. I'm not a scientist, so I can only tell you what I've read as an archivist and librarian, and that it very much depends on the company and their database, how accurate your results might be. And science at that level often deals in probabilities. So as much as we would like to, learn for absolutely 100% certain that we had a certain ancestor who lived in a certain part of the world, that's very unlikely to happen, at least with where the technology is now. So I think it can be an interesting experience for people. I think I've also heard stories, and I've had people come into the archives who suddenly discover that they have relatives that they didn't know they had, which can be very exciting. It can also be very traumatic. So to some extent, people have to be prepared for that happening.
Right.
But if your curiosity leads you in that direction, sure, go ahead.
Ev is wondering how to write your personal or family history. If you don't do it, who will? By Katie Funk Weed. She's recommending this book, I think. Can you say anything about that book?
Well, I'll just mention, I did not talk about family memoirs specifically. That's a whole other area. And I was talking to our acquisitions librarian recently, and the way it works in the library world is there's kind of two very distinct places in the library where we put genealogies in one place and we put family histories in the other place. And there are so many more books coming up now that mesh both. And I think that's partly to do with the way we're exploring our emotional connection to our family histories, not just knowing the bloodlines, but understanding where we came from in an emotional way. So yeah, I did one of my favorite topics when I was doing my master's degree is reading those Mennonite family memoirs. And there's more and more coming out all the time. They're really wonderful.
Is there a grandma equivalent for Swiss Mennonite names?
So if you are from Waterloo region, very specifically, there is something called Ezra Eby Revived, based on Ezra Eby's biographical history of Waterloo Township, which is kind of like the Bible of Waterloo region Mennonite genealogy. There is in, trying to remember the name, Saga, Swiss Anabaptist Genealogical Association, I believe, located in the American Midwest. They have quite a large database as well. I don't have a lot of experience searching in that particular one, but I understand it's quite substantial. I'll mention that we at Conrad Grebel in the library, we try to collect every genealogy we can, particularly of Canadian families, but because the families are so intertwined, often North American families as well. So if you've got a genealogy, an extra copy, and we don't have it, we love it when that happens, and we'd love to get a copy. It's not online in the same way, but again, it's another way to kind of verify what you're learning online.
If you uncover secrets in your family, example, adopted versus biological children, etc., what is your responsibility to the person who has passed away and may never have shared it versus wanting to share this with others in your family because it clarifies some things? Have you ever had to deal with that or witnessed that kind of thing?
That's a great question. And like I said, over time, attitudes to that have changed. And this is where the choice part comes in, the design. People will handle this in different ways. Sometimes it will be very discrete notations. Other times it might be the center of the story. I'll just tell you, give you a little example. So I received this genealogy from a woman who, it was actually her husband's family. This is another thing you often find women doing genealogies of their husband's family. I find that fascinating. But she wrote me this lovely letter and just said, I really wanted to have this genealogy of my husband published. And by the way, my husband, this is his family circumstance. His mother was actually his aunt, and she told me the whole story in the letter. And it's only because she told me that whole story so explicitly that I was able to open the genealogy. And it took me a while, but I was able to piece together the story she had just told me. So it was discreet, I think, and reverential to the people involved. but she was also telling the truth. And I think it really depends on the family and you and where you're at and how comfortable you are with that. But there's always a way to tell the stories. And if I had to kind of declare a bias, I would say that I think the more we know about our ancestors, the more we can relate to them as individuals and human beings, the better it is for the family and for us to kind of honor their lived experience through understanding what truly happened to them.
Mm-hmm. And Karen is asking, what's the difference between using the Mennonite genealogy source and ancestry.com?
I don't have a lot of experience with Ancestry directly. I think what you have to ultimately look at is what are the sources that are cited? How well are they cited? And if the sources are good, then it probably doesn't matter. If the sources are bad, then then they're less reliable. So, and it's always good to maybe try both, try Grandma, try Ancestry. Another one that I really like to go to, especially because it has a lot of Ontario civil records, is the FamilySearch.org. And because it will take you directly to scans of the original documents. So the more you can get close to understanding what those primary sources say, the more the better it is.
Rhonda brings up a point. She says, when you find an error in a database that you know for a fact is an error, how do you handle this to have it corrected?
I think it's a sign of a good database that they have a mechanism for that. I don't know if she is referring to a specific database, but normally there should be somewhere in the database, if it's a good one, there should be a way to contact someone to verify that a change needs to be made.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And Carol says, the Oxford Notes of 1924 describe immigration to Ontario and Manitoba. Do we have good information prior to that from Ukraine?
So do we have good records from Mennonites living in Ukraine, in Imperial? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would again go to kind of MennoniteGenealogy.com, and there is a whole section there on Russia and various other parts of that world. And I'm sure there's a Russian Mennonite genealogist right now jumping up and down saying, you didn't mention this or that source. But that would be the place I would start.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you so much, Laureen. That was fascinating. It was neat to see how different people represent their family trees. And I'm sure you've sparked several people thinking, oh, I think I want to make a family tree or record my family history somehow.